Very sad pictures there from Ukraine. Well, the NATO summit taking place in Washington, D.C. is our leading story tonight. Representatives from all 32 member states and their allies have gathered to discuss a number of issues, including Ukraine. Some stipulate that the summit could result in the outline of a pathway or bridge to membership for Ukraine. Well, to discuss what we can expect in this regard, we're joined by Rachel Rizzo, Atlantic Council. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening. Great having you on. So let me start by asking you, I mean, there are very high expectations by Ukrainian leadership towards this summit. However, I believe the situation was very similar last year at the Vilnius summit. So do you think that this year will be different?
I think this year will be different because Ukrainian leaders and NATO leaders have met continuously at the highest levels to avoid the ferry situation that happened at Vilnius last year, where there seemed to be a lot of disappointment on the Ukrainian side about what NATO had actually outlined for them. While there isn't an invitation on the table to join NATO for Ukraine, there's a lot of other stuff that I think will help them in their fight against Russia's full-scale invasion. NATO is setting up a command in Wiesbaden, Germany, that will help organize security assistance and training for Ukrainians. They are sending a senior civilian representative to Kyiv on a permanent basis to help organize that security assistance and training. They also have a $40 billion monetary package of lethal and non-lethal aid for the next year for Ukraine. So I think this shows that there is great unity amongst NATO allies about the need to continue supporting Ukraine. And that should be a pretty successful story to tell here in Washington over the next couple of days.
Indeed, it sounds very positive, Rachel. It seems as though NATO is bringing Ukraine closer in terms of interoperability. But what are the main hurdles, really, in the way of Ukraine? I mean, we hear about corruption being one of them. We hear about the fact that there is a war on Ukrainian territory. What else is preventing a rapid accession to NATO by Ukraine?
Look, the bridge to NATO for Ukraine is well lit and it's made of steel. It's irreversible, as I think that will be a word that is going to be in the communique that comes out of this summit. But you're right in that there are some pretty clear challenges that have plagued Ukraine for years that have made its accession into NATO very difficult. Corruption is one of them. The fact that they are at war, that part of their territory is under occupation is another problem. But people will point to the fact that in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO allies made a similar pledge to both Georgia and Ukraine, saying that they would eventually become NATO members, but offering no clear pathway as to how or when that might happen. And as we know, Russia then invaded Georgia in 2008, annexed Crimea in 2014, and invaded again in Ukraine in 2022. So the desire is to bring Ukraine closer to NATO with the knowledge that full membership that comes along with Article 5 guarantees, mutual defense guarantees, is maybe a little bit further away than perhaps Ukraine would like it to be. But NATO is working on getting it there. We'll see how long it takes.
All right, so we took a look at Ukraine just now, but what about NATO member states, which are also facing some internal problems? Germany, France, the upcoming elections in the US. Could these be a hindrance to the final outcome of the summit?
So the big elephant in the room, of course, is the U.S. election that's happening in November, and the performance by President Biden at the debate a couple weeks ago that left a lot to be desired on behalf of not just Democrats in the United States, but probably foreign leaders as well, who are probably rightly concerned about his performance. But the United States is not the only country that is experiencing some political upheaval. Of course, in addition to Biden's difficulties that he's experienced, the potential of Trump's return is also looming large as well. So that's in the United States. But yes, Germany has had some pressure from the far right. Macron dissolved parliament a few weeks ago after his party's poor showing in the European parliamentary elections. However, the French people repudiated the far right in the 2 rounds of voting that happened on the 30th and on the 7th. So there's actually a pretty good story to tell here. And the hope is that these leaders can come together and tell it and sell the story of NATO, not just amongst themselves and to the elites that already believe in it, but to their populations, to the American people, to the French people, to the German people, and civilians all across the NATO alliance.
So you've mentioned the presidential elections happening in the US in the fall. So let me ask you about this Trump proofing. What is this idea? What does it entail? And will it come into fruition?
So the idea of Trump-proofing the NATO alliance is putting mechanisms and measures in place that would protect the NATO alliance from a potential second Trump term and from potential efforts that he or his high-level associates, should he be elected again, might try to put in place that could create fissures and divisions amongst NATO allies and fundamentally undermine the safety and security of the alliance. But what I like to remind European leaders of is that, yes, rhetoric can be damaging. And I think that Trump's rhetoric towards NATO was damaging. But the policies that he put in place toward Europe did not directly damage NATO. Of course, there was that plan that never really came to fruition of removing 12,000 troops from Germany, but half of those troops were going to be sent east to Poland and to other countries, and the other half were going to be cycled through in Europe on a rotational basis. So I like to remind people that NATO, again, has a great story to tell. 23 out of 32 NATO allies are spending the target of 2% of GDP on defense now. So tell that story and sell that to Trump, because NATO's membership is not just beneficial for allies in Europe. It's beneficial for the United States as well. And I think that Trump and his team believe that. It's just that they also think that the Europeans need to do more to shoulder the burden of their own security. And the Europeans are doing that. So I'm hopeful that should he return, we should be okay.
Right. Okay. Rachel, I want to go back to Ukraine's accession when it happens. Now, you know, when Sweden and Finland were accepted into NATO, it was pretty fast track. But there was a fly in the ointment, wasn't there? It was Turkey. Would you expect Turkey to behave in a similar way when Ukraine's accession is being discussed?
Well, Turkey and Sweden have had a particularly contentious relationship because of how Turkey thinks that Sweden has gone too easy on members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, that they view as terrorists and other countries view as terrorists as well. There was also an arms embargo on Turkey that Sweden put in place. So that was like a very personal bilateral issue that came into play there. But I do think that Ukraine will have some serious challenges when its membership is ultimately on the table. Because what comes along with membership, as I mentioned before, is Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all. And although there's nuance to that language, it does suggest that NATO members will come to the aid, the military aid of a country that is under attack. The only time that that's been invoked in NATO's history is right after September 11th, 2001 in the United States. And so we have to make sure that there is broad consensus amongst NATO allies that they are ready to come to Ukraine's aid should it join NATO at some point. And that's going to be difficult. There are challenges that come along with that. Countries like Turkey, countries like Hungary especially. But NATO has survived for 75 years. It is unified. That's a pretty impressive feat. And they've figured out how to overcome challenges in the past. And the hope is that they would overcome this one as well. But we'll have to wait and see what happens when that membership is actually on the table and when an invitation is actually given. And I think that's going to be pretty far down the line, if I'm being honest.
Since we've already touched upon the Middle East, let me follow and ask you about the war in Gaza. Do you think that this will also be one of the topics, and will NATO try to do something to contain this conflict? We know that US, UK and Germany are supplying Israel with weapons, perhaps something on that front.
I mean, this is certainly a war that has taken up most of the time in Washington. A colleague at a different think tank a couple of days ago, I heard them say that Ukraine is the second most important war in Washington right now. And that's true. The Israel-Gaza war is eating up most of the bandwidth for the highest level of leaders in the United States because of the relationship that the United States has with Israel. But this is not something that is going to be on the docket for official discussions at NATO. It's not going to be in the communique. If there are any other issues outside of the war in Ukraine, outside of NATO's borders that are going to be discussed, it's definitely going to be NATO's southern flank, and its relationship with its Indo-Pacific partners and pushing back against Chinese aggression. So I wouldn't expect much from NATO leaders on behalf of the Israel-Gaza war. These are bilateral discussions that are happening more behind closed doors. But we'll have to see what happens with that. There might be some comments that are made, but I don't think any official channels will discuss this.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing your analysis with our audience. Do come and see us again soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.